Hi, this is Street Life and I'm Natasha, back at it with a review and discussion of The French Connection. You might be noticing a trend with these reviews, which is that I love thrillers and action movies, and a subgenre within that I like is police procedurals. And I especially like, I guess one of the benefits, I think, to some older police procedural type movies is that they came out at a time when, let's say, DNA evidence or some of these other technological advances that we now take for granted just weren't around. In this case, The French Connection, where you have the story of two police officers who are trying to find the source for large amounts of heroin that's making its way into the country. And because the movie takes place in the 1970s, or at least was released in the 1970s, you don't have this proliferation of modern technology. So a lot of their police work relies on them getting out onto the street, questioning people, gathering evidence, and investigating without a lot of, with really just basic resources at their disposal. It's something that you don't really see in a lot of films today. Not to say that it never happens, right? I think some of the better films and TV shows tend to rely more on this kind of stuff. But with that, action films, a large part of the presentation of police investigations has moved more towards your SWAT team type situation, where there's a greater reliance on brawn rather than brain power. Guns, explosions, things like that. Less analytical work, less investigation. There's more emphasis on firepower, shootouts, than investigation. But with The French Connection, which I saw for the first time a few years ago and was really impressed by, you have this cat and mouse game within the film. Basically, two detectives are leading an investigation to try to find the source of heroin that's coming into the country, and it's like very high quality drugs. And on the other side of this, you have fairly sophisticated criminals in the sense of they're not just out in the street running amok, shooting up or whatever, but rather that they move rather quietly. They use ingenious methods to bring the drugs into the country. It's a pretty smooth operation. And so on both sides of the equation, you have a lot of brain power at work where the criminals are actually relatively smart. And I wouldn't say it's a cerebral film. It's not that deep. But the game of cat and mouse, the field is even. You don't have dumb criminals on one side and this super smart sleuth on the other. The bad guys seem very equally matched to the capabilities of the police officers. And so in the case of these two officers, them investigating, and over the course of the film, we see them kind of working their way up the ladder, figuring things out, getting some insight into how this organization works. When the film starts out, we see them undercover, roughing up some guys on the street. Not to say that's right, but we see that at the early stages of the film. And those are these little things that play out throughout the movies, right? Things that constantly come up, which is maybe someone else can explain it to me, right? This thing of them constantly mentioning when questioning people about playing with your feet in Poughkeepsie. When interrogating someone. It's should you find yourself under investigation by the police, you've been dragged into the police station or stopped on the street for questioning about drugs. And in the midst of this tense interrogation, the police officer just randomly asks you, have you ever been to Poughkeepsie? Which is random enough, right? Poughkeepsie is a small town north of New York City. But taking it further beyond that to ask you about playing with your feet. Now, the first time I heard this in the movie, and it was what is this? But then it crops up at other points in the film. And I guess maybe it's a matter of you have a suspect or a potential witness, and you're undergoing this tense interrogation. In the midst of that, you ask this random question, which might throw them off, because it's you have some experienced criminals and things like that. They've probably been pulled in a time or two by the police for questioning. And here it is that you might have your story rehearsed or whatever, know what you're going to say, what you're not going to say. But then here's this random question that's just seemingly insane. And it comes out of nowhere, which might serve to throw you off because it disrupts the flow of the conversation up to that point, right? The interrogation up to that point would be pretty normal, right? I watch movies and these little tidbits, these smart little things that are thrown in there, I kind of enjoy them, right? It's one of the things that kind of stick out to me that come to mind and that I associate with the movie, right? I don't know that it necessarily stuck out the previous times that I watched it, but I noticed it this time. Just to summarize, you had pretty much large quantities of heroin being brought into America. This is before, let's say, the Vietnam War in the 70s, when drugs started coming more directly from Asia. And what you had was, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was like a series of real life police investigations found that there were pizza parlors and like Italian run businesses through which drugs were being distributed. I think they were bringing them in like canned tomatoes or something like that. And so, the mob was involved, where they were bringing heroin into the country through their connections in France. I want to say Corsica, I believe it was. And they were using various ingenious methods to smuggle the drugs into the country. One method that's shown here, and it stood out to me because I think it was maybe early this year or late last year, I was watching Godfather of Harlem, which is a television series starring Forrest Whitaker as Bumpy Johnson. And he buys heroin from the Italians. And there's mention of like the French Connection, where the drugs are coming into the country hidden away in compartments within vehicles. And so in the case of Bumpy Johnson, the ships are arriving at the docks. You see them unloading these cars, which they would then take to like a mechanic shop or auto body shop, where these hidden compartments would be opened and the drugs would be in there. Here we see like both sides of the story. We mostly follow the police officers, the investigators, the detectives, but we also see some parts of the other side of the equation, right? The people smuggling the drugs into the country. And so what we realize is that they're bringing drugs into the country in these hidden compartments within these vehicles. And they place them on these ships where they're coming in on containers. And so it's like you can have several kilos of heroin hidden away in each vehicle. And it looks like you're importing legitimate goods into the country, right? But really they're using these cars as cover for smuggling drugs into the country. And it's interesting because you get to see the criminal investigation, right? That side of what's going on. But it's interesting to see the police investigate and see them put the pieces together and figure out what's happening. There's a few things that really stood out to me. One of which is they're surveilling a potential suspect, right? Or rather people of interest, because at this point, at this level, they're not really interested in the street level dealers. They've moved beyond that. They're kind of moving up the food chain to try to figure out who's smuggling the drugs into the country. These people aren't going to be standing out on the corner, right? They're not out in the open. They're more low key with how they manage their affairs. But it takes a little bit of time for the officers to identify the players because they're keeping a low profile. They're out in the open, but their street activities are hidden. It's kept under wraps. So part of the investigation is trying to figure out who the players are. And there's one guy who I think is like a diplomat or at least some kind of public figure who, when he arrives at the country, there's actually a press conference, right? And it turns out that he's involved in the smuggling of drugs. He plays a role in these shipments coming to the country. He arrives and he doesn't broadcast he's helping to bring these drugs into the country, but you see this public face that he has. But then at the same time, we as the audience know that he's involved with these shady dealings. And one of my favorite scenes in the movie, there's actually two. Given that this is New York City, right, some of the action takes place on the MTA, which is like the train system. And you have these chases that take place, one of which is on the train, right? And it ends up devolving into gunfire, where the Gene Hackman character chases the bad guy onto the train, but he ends up getting left behind, right? And so the guy commandeers the train to try to escape. Typically, a train will make stops along the way because this isn't like a long distance or like a regional train. It should be stopping every few minutes. But with the bad guy on the train, him taking control, like forcing the conductor to bypass stops, you then have Gene Hackman's character who commandeers a private vehicle. It's like a tough day to be in New York on that day. And you see him driving through the streets of New York, trying to keep an eye on the elevated train, right? Trying to track down this guy. There's an exchange and whatnot where, unfortunately, someone ends up losing their life. But the sequence is actually quite riveting because you have all of these innocent people on the train and you have this guy who has a gun on the train. He's desperate to get away and is really willing to do just about anything to escape. And you then have Gene Hackman's character, I can't remember his name, closing in on him. It's very action-packed because you have the threat of this guy carrying a gun, and he's very willing to use it. And it's a very exciting scene because you see Gene Hackman's character like trying to trace this train down in a car, and it's a very unconventional chase. If you're on a train, like, I don't even know how would you chase down a train, right? It's typically like a car chase, so like two cars chasing each other, or like a car chasing a truck or something like that, or a motorcycle. But here you have one guy using a public train to try to escape, and a police officer giving chase in a commandeer car. It's probably one of my favorites. It is one of my favorite scenes in the movie. But then you have another chase that takes place a bit later on in the movie, and that one is one of my favorite scenes in the movie. Once again, Gene Hackman's character, I think his name is Jimmy, he is now following another guy, once again on a train. It reminds me a little bit of this scene from The Wire, where you have Avon Barksdale. He's leaving a basketball game, and the detectives are trailing him. They start out not really knowing much about his organization. They're trying to put names with faces. He's a big-time drug dealer in Baltimore, but keeps a low profile. So the police don't necessarily know what he looks like initially, right? They don't know much about him. So in trying to learn more about him, they surveil him and they follow him to this basketball game. He leaves the game. They decide to follow him to see where he's going, what he might be doing. And what ends up happening is that Avon leads them on like this cat and mouse chase through the streets of Baltimore, where you hear this like safety precaution that people suggest sometimes, where if you think you're being followed, you make like 3 left turns or 3 right turns, right? Because you and someone else could simply be going in the same direction. But if you make 1 left turn and they make a left turn, okay, fine. But if you make 2, they fall behind, or, something like that, maybe not cause for concern. But if you make 3 turns and you circle the block, you make 3 turns and then go straight and they follow you, there's a chance that they are following you. And so you see this with Avon, where he makes a couple of stops, he makes some turns, and you realize at the end of it where he kind of like doubles back on the police officers and drives by them waving his finger, letting them know that he knows who they are. Because up to this point, they've been following him with multiple vehicles. They've been following him for like a little while. One would fall off, another would pick up the chase, but he maneuvers in a way where he's able to double back on them, confirming to himself that he's indeed being followed and letting them know that he knows that they're following him. And so it's like, you kind of see that here, but it's 2 people on the train, Jimmy and this guy from like from the French Connection. And the French guy is like just seemingly going about his day. He's on the train. He has a newspaper or whatever. You see him walking out in the streets. He steps onto the train. He steps off from the train. He goes to a nearby shop, looks over some products. And here you have Jimmy following him. It's put into this position of New York is a big city. People stepping onto the same train, that's not out of the norm. But if we both step on the train, you step off, I step off, that might be cause of concern. You go to a nearby shop, I move to the nearby shop. What are the odds that we just be randomly following these same exact steps? What are the odds that we both get onto the train, I get off the train, and you also have a need to step off the train as well? There ends up being like this next instance of like a cat and mouse game between the 2 of them, where as with Avon, becoming aware that he's being followed, he takes advantage of the opportunity to kind of draw things out, to make certain. And in the same vein here, the French guy does this to Jimmy, right? In that he takes advantage of the opportunity to kind of flush out Jimmy, right? To confirm to himself that he's indeed being followed. And it's a pretty interesting scene. It's also pretty exciting, but it's different from the other chase scene in the sense of there's no guns at play here. It never really breaks out into the open. It remains covert, a Cold War of sorts, where it's the 2 of them trying to outsmart each other. The bad guy is trying to go about his business or wherever it is that he needs to get to, but at the same time trying to figure out whether or not Jimmy, whether that character is following him. And so it's interesting to see how he maneuvers. It goes back to this thing I said about within this film, the criminals and the police officers are, evenly matched when it comes to wits. It makes for an even more interesting movie because as the movie plays out, and this is now like several decades since the movie was released, but it still makes it very interesting and exciting to watch. If you're looking for like the shoot 'em up, big explosion type stuff of modern day films, you won't find that here. You know, there are some shootouts, but much of the action is more subtle. And although it's now several decades later, I think it still feels fresh and interesting, very exciting. Years ago when I watched it for the first time, I thought it was a cool movie, and I still feel that way now in rewatching it like several years later. In time, you kind of forget like little details and whatnot, but watching it the second time around and knowing the basic gist of the story, I still found it enjoyable. It's not necessarily a movie that is a part of that group that I watch like every year or maybe every 2 years, but it is a movie that you can watch every so often and it'll remain interesting. It'll remain entertaining. And so with that, I highly recommend The French Connection. Thanks for tuning in. To ensure you don't miss any episodes, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my movie review playlist. Go ahead and click the thumbs up button if you like what you saw, and go ahead and share it on social media.